it seems to me that the reflex at the European level generally is whatever the crisis, no questions asked whether more centralization is going to be useful or not. More centralization is the answer. If whatever the crisis, you always say centralization, 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 then obviously you are going to also answer to crises in a wrong way and exacerbate the problem instead of alleviating it. If competence creep continues the way that it has over the past decades, then Brexit is not going to be a sole outlier. There is a real risk of this being repeated by other European countries.
Welcome back to MCC Brussels and our podcast series, Deep Dives. Today on the programme, we challenge the sacred dogmas of Brussels, question the conventional wisdom of the ever closer union, and ask what all this actually means for democracy in Europe. I'm your host, John O'Brien, Head of Communications at MCC Brussels, and today we're taking on one of the most uncomfortable truths about the European Union, that the EU's institutions have repeatedly expanded their own powers far beyond what the member states ever signed up to. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's documented in case law, in delegated acts, in crisis governance, in creeping technocratic decision-making that bypasses democratic scrutiny. And few people have documented as thoroughly as today's guest. Dr. Philip Siegert, Deputy Research Director at MCC Brussels and author of the major new report, Empire of Law, the EU's March Beyond Democracy. And his argument is simple but devastating. If the EU continues to expand its competencies through judicial activism, bureaucratic opportunism, and crisis politics, it risks further backlash, more constitutional confrontations, and perhaps even more exits. Today, we're cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Today, we explore the sobering conclusion that competence creep is not an accident. It is a system. A system where the courts reinterpret the treaties, where the Commission legislates through guidelines and delegated acts, where crises become opportunities for centralization, and where financial conditionality can be used as leverage against democratically elected governments. Whether you believe the EU can be reformed or needs a more profound reset, one thing is clear. A Europe that respects national sovereignty, the rule of law, and democratic accountability is not a backward step. It may be the only way to preserve the Union in the long run. Listen, in the notes below, check out Philip's report, Empire of Law, the EU's March Beyond Democracy. Give it a read. Tell us what you think in the comments. We want to hear from you. I'm John O'Brien. This has been Deep Dives. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, we need you to subscribe, to share this podcast, and keep questioning the Brussels orthodoxy. Our future depends on it. Philip, welcome to Deep Dives, where we get to really delve into your new report for our viewers and listeners. Let's start bluntly. Is competence creep just a polite academic term for Brussels grabbing powers it was never given?
In a sense, it is, but it also describes a process which is one way in which, as you say, Brussels grabs power. And it is, in a way, something that is natural, if you will, to bureaucracies, to technocratic organizations. Also at the national level, they grow. And this is something that you can very well observe with the European Union. And competence creep, while being an academic term, describes this part of the power increase of the centralized level.
Is that something then that happens organically, like a plant growing or a weed? Or is it something that some people have as their ambition, federalism?
Both. So you have one part of it where it is, in a way, indeed like an organic growth. Unless you take care of the garden, it's going to look like a pretty wild mess. And the other part is the active push for more competencies at the centralized level. So there are these two components to competence creep. One could be perhaps called the passive one, if you will, and the other, the federalist push, as you put it, the active side of competence creep.
You emphasize the principle of conferral, the idea that Brussels can only act where states explicitly allow it. When historically did the European Union begin treating this principle as something it could reinterpret rather than respect?
I'd say there are two, well, there are more than two, but the two first steps on this road came very early on. The first one in 1956 with the decision, the Fédération Charbonnière decision by the European Court of Justice. And in this, the court applied to the coal and steel community, applied a principle from international law to, or from law in general, to the ECSC treaty. So, and this is the doctrine of implied powers. If you put something into the treaties, for instance, the high authority has to, which is the first name of the commission in a way, has to perform a specific task, then the High Commission will say, in order to perform this task, we need X, Y, and Z as well as competencies to fulfill the purpose that you have given us in the treaties. So this is implied powers. This is something which is not unusual. It's not a new legal construct in legal thinking overall. So there was the introduction of implied powers into the court's logic of how it reads, interprets, and applies the ECSC treaty. The next step, a few years later, went much further, in my opinion, and that is the doctrine of primacy, in which the European Court of Justice established that the law at the supranational level would supersede law at the national level, and it has proceeded to keep up with this interpretation, even in domains where it is at least very contestable to have this opinion, all the way through the conflict, one of the conflicts that we have in recent times, which is at the constitutional level, that the European Court of Justice makes decisions which go against the constitutional order of the nation states. And at the latest, at this point, you see that the principle of conferral has been thrown out of the window.
To many skeptics, the European Court of Justice acts less like a court and more like an engine for federalism. In your view, what single doctrine, direct effect, primacy, or implied powers has done the most to damage national sovereignty?
The way that the court applies it, I would say it's the one of primacy, though all three that you mentioned play an important role in having brought about this evolution. Probably the primacy doctrine would not have had as strong an effect as it had without the impact of other rulings on subsidiarity, the direct effect doctrine, the implied powers doctrine. But I would say that, the most important one that infringes upon the principle of conferral and the basic building system of the European Union is the way that the European Court of Justice applies the doctrine of primacy.
Cohen Lennartz famously said there is no nucleus of sovereignty member states can invoke against the Union. Is that not Brussels' real ideology laid bare, that national sovereignty is merely tolerated until it gets in the way?
For a considerable portion of the decision makers in Brussels, I think that is the view that they indeed hold. The idea is that somehow the European Union would be on a non-negotiable, natural path to federal unity, which is something which has been contested from various political directions and has been contested in each of the European states. So there's nothing natural or non-negotiable about this. So there's a specific ideological view on what the EU is and should be. And this perhaps speaks to the quote by Koen Lennartz that you just brought, which I think he wrote in the 1990s already. So today is at the head of the CJAU. But this is not a new position that he would hold now that he is at the court. The idea that there is we're traveling towards happy unification, is something which is held by an important number of political decision makers, but it's not in the treaties. It doesn't have the popular support or the government support in sufficient number of European states, or perhaps even in any of the European states individually. So it is a political project of a small group. It is one political project among many, but this is not what the EU is. It is what the EU is in their view, but this is not what the EU really is.
Do you think that among some people, sovereignty has been, the value of sovereignty has been diminished? The idea that, sovereignty, that's going to lead to nationalism, and nationalism is going to get us into World War III, just like it got us into World War I or II. Like that way of thinking, not seeing sovereignty as being a positive, not seeing nationalism as being something to be proud of. Do you think that that is prevalent within not just the EU institutions, not just the people who work around the system, but also, sadly, in Europe today?
I think the background of the European project in its very beginning is important for that. And what you just mentioned was the sovereignty and nationalism. So I'd put those two on two different planes and treat them separately. Start with nationalism. Not in an ethical, but in a logical sense, the negative point of departure of the European Union is nationalism. So this is not the idea we want to go towards something, but the idea, hence negative, we want to go away from something that has proven bad in the past, as you said, with the two world wars and nationalism. So the logic was we have to move away from this. Where to is not so clear, but we have to move away.
But nationalism hasn't always been bad for everybody. I wouldn't have thought Swedish nationalism, don't mind Irish nationalism, they haven't always led to bad places. They've led to freedom and they've led to a particular culture or way of thinking. So why is it that nationalism gets such a bad rap, do you think?
Because the term is used for chauvinism.
Yes.
And what really the EU project wants to move away from is chauvinism, but the term that's used for it, inappropriately to some extent, is nationalism. So if you do this with the, let's say, the population that had the experience of World War II, and you have the rhetoric of moving away from nationalism in the 1960s and 70s, you understand what is meant by this. Today, it's the idea of nationhood itself, which is equated with nationalism, which is equated with chauvinism. So you have a connection of terms which are not do not mean the same thing. And this means that the federalist drive comes from, in large portion, from this negative motivation to move away from something, and it has been broadened to move away not just from chauvinism, but to move away from nationalism, to move away from nationhood as such. And this speaks to the second point that you raised of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty might have different levels at which you implement it. Might be local, might be regional, might be national, might actually be even European. But you have to be clear about what you want to place where. And I think one of the major problems of the European Union today, and this is where competence creep also puts cracks into the architecture of it, is to be clear about who gets to decide what, where it affects sovereignty. And this is a very important question because you cannot have a democratic system if it is not sovereign. Otherwise, how can the population or the government that's elected decide sovereignly what political path they want to go down? So sovereignty is something that the EU should protect, and the sovereignty is with the masters of the treaties still. So that is the states. And the small group that you, or growing group perhaps, that you mentioned of the federalists and those who push for competence creep goes against sovereignty, because by reducing sovereignty within the European states, or the sovereignty of the European states, but not providing something at least equivalently strongly protecting them at the European level, you are only going to reduce sovereignty in Europe overall. And this is something that we have seen with European policies in various fields now over at least 2 decades, perhaps even more.
Your report argues that during the Greek debt crisis, EU institutions effectively bypassed their own limits. What is the clearest example of Brussels acting in this way beyond the treaties during that period?
So to start with, the European Commission and the European Central Bank ganged up, if you will, with the International Monetary Fund, and then said, what we're doing in this Troika arrangement is international law, is not EU law. So we do not act as EU institutions, we act as brokering partners with the IMF on behalf of arranging an international agreement to bail out, as it were, the Greek state. The limitations that the European treaties, also the European Convention on Human Rights, also United Nations conventions, quite a number of international treaties and European law, put on the actions of every European actor, be it the EU itself, be it national governments, were circumvented in taking this Troika approach. One example are pensions, the tax system, the social security system in Greece. Perhaps the most blatant example of this is the limitation of the right to strike and to demonstrate, which is protected under European law, under UN conventions, and obviously under the national law of probably all European states at the national level. So there is what you could observe, and what was already criticized vividly back then, is those two EU institutions, the Central Bank and the Commission, sort of placing themselves outside the EU legal order to do something which the EU legal order does not permit. And once this is done, then go back into EU legal order and enforce what has been decided in the Troika. It is, however, necessary to say that they were supported in doing so by a number of European states and national governments, first and foremost, the German and the French one.
Yeah. Euro enthusiasts say that in a crisis, someone has to act. Isn't that exactly the problem? That every crisis becomes an excuse for the EU to grab a new set of powers. As Thomas Fazzi, our colleague, said, the EU seemed to never let a crisis go to waste. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this is also what, I'm not quite sure which Commission president said that, but that is indeed the exact words by, perhaps it's Juncker, but I'm not sure. So that is something that Fazzi picks up from actually the high EU representative saying themselves. And there is something to be said independently of EU level or not. There is something to be said about grasping the opportunity that a crisis presents. The problem is rather to do what? And it seems to me that the reflex at the European level generally is, whatever the crisis, no questions asked whether more centralization is going to be useful or not. More centralization is the answer. So you skip the question and you immediately go to the next step. More union, more European level activity. So it is almost like a reflex that is not thought about, which is to say, whenever something arises, when there is a crisis, when there is a problem, the answer somehow has to be, without even thinking about it, more Europeanization, more centralization at the European level. And there are crises where it is much more sensible to decentralize to deal with it.
Yeah.
There are crises in which centralization might indeed be a good option. But if whatever the crisis, you always say centralization, 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 then obviously you are going to also answer to crises in a wrong way and exacerbate the problem instead of alleviating it.
Let's talk about comitology and delegated acts. Is it fair to say that real lawmaking in Brussels increasingly happens in rooms with no elected officials present?
Yes. There are, especially since the introduction of comitology and of the delegated acts. So comitology means that the decision is taken administratively, if you will, but national civil servants are participating in the discussions around these decisions. So it happens within the Commission apparatus, but national civil servants contribute to the discussions and the decision making in there. It's different with the delegated and the implementing acts. of the Commission. There is some oversight by the national levels, but there are instances in which there is no oversight and the Commission moves alone. And the unhappy tendency of the Council has become to say, if we cannot find a political compromise within ourselves, amongst ourselves, at the Council meetings or at the meetings even of the heads of state, then we make a more or less general declaration what we think would be a good direction to travel in, but lacking the decisive. It's not just details; it's really the key items of how to put an idea into reality, which is more important than just the administrative details. But it is being pushed down the road to the Commission, and the Council says, "Yeah, we sort of found an agreement which roughly resembles this." And how this is then being put into reality, well, that's the Commission's problem. And then the Commission stands there. So this is the Council shifting decision-making to the Commission out of laziness in a way, and for political communication, so that the Council can say, great meeting, we found a compromise and European spirit, and yada, yada, yada. And then you sit there in the Commission and you have to deal with whatever the Council put on the table. And this led to some really strange decisions that are politically relevant but have been taken in closed doors. Commission technical decisions, and two examples that are in the report are on glyphosate and on genetically modified organisms. So that is something which is politically hotly debated across the European public, and has been kicked by the Council to the Commission and for it to deal with it. This is not to say that the Commission would not be happy in other instances with the possibility of moving to implementing and to delegated acts, and because it also gives room for maneuver to the Commission, which perhaps is more than it should have, given that the Council should give clearer directions on where to travel.
Now, you argue the Council enables this by kicking the can down the road. Are national leaders complicit in letting Brussels expand its power because it lets them avoid responsibility at home?
There is also this at play, yes. And if you look at the two political landscapes that I'm relatively familiar with are the German and the French one, and you see this frequently, I guess also in most other states. If there is something unpopular and it has been decided at the European level, it is easier in a way to communicate to the constituency at home saying, well, it's not what we would have wished for, but it is something that we accepted because of it being useful for the European project or something similar. So it is communication over sensible decision-making.
So, cutting to the chase, rule of law conditionality, has it become a political weapon for the Commission to target governments it disagrees with?
The case that I'm looking at in the paper is that of spending conditionality, and it's a very interesting development. You have, indeed, in the European treaties, conditionality already set in there, but it is for the states and the Council to really deal with issues arising from, for instance, EU values, rule of law, democracy. And what the Commission did with the spending conditionality is to introduce a new tool, and this was identified from the very beginning by the legal services of the Council. The Commission introduced, that was in 2022, introduced a mechanism which they called spending conditionality, which is, as they presented it, supposed to protect the EU budget and how the funds are being used essentially to avoid corruption, which sounds sensible.
Yeah.
The thing is that it is probably by intention, as far as the documents is really by design, a Trojan horse for the Commission to open up the values, the democracy and the rule of law items for decisions taken by the Commission and not by the Council. So this is something which goes, I would say, which goes against at least the spirit of the treaties. You can find a legalistic way to base them on the treaties, but it is something which clearly in my opinion, goes against what the treaties are supposed to protect in terms of rule of law, value, and democracy.
There seems to be a lot of sleight of hand, a lot of Trojan horses when we look at these type of things. With the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the Commission can approve or block funds based on extremely broad country-specific recommendations. Is this effectively financial blackmail dressed up as compliance?
It can be used as such, yes. And it has been used as such in the past. Probably it's going to be used as such also in the future. I don't see how there would be a political reorientation, or in the good sense of the word, neutralization of the Commission's approach to this. So yes, it is used as a political tool. And this is one where, as you said, there's a catalog of country recommendations.
Yeah.
You can put more or less anything and everything in there. It's for the Commission to appreciate how well progress has been made. The Council has something to say in that, but not all. So the Commission still retains leeway in saying, yeah, we're happy or we are not happy.
Leading on from that, would you agree that under the current mechanisms, a Commission with a certain ideological agenda could do enormous damage to conservative governments?
I think this is the observation of the past 2 or 3 years. I mean, more than that, but with regards to the recovery and resilience funds, that is the time frame. And indeed, somehow the Commission has it in for this type of government. And this, as with the country specific recommendations, this is something which is administrative and used for political purposes. But you cannot challenge it politically because it is in the administrative box in a way.
Yeah.
And this is something which is useful for the Commission as a tool, but is something which is detrimental to the functioning of the EU as such, and is damaging in the long term also to the Commission itself. So it is a short-term tactic, but has no long-term strategy that would lead to a positive or good end.
You link competence creep to referenda failures, constitutional court pushback, and of course, Brexit. Is Brexit just a British outliner, or the logical outcome if you have decades of overreach?
I think for Britain, it is in a way a logical outcome given the political culture of the country. The political culture of Germany is different. The political culture of France is different. So it does yield different results. But what is observable, I think, across Europe, and I think that's the most striking example today is Czechia, where about a third of the population is really dissatisfied with the European Union, considering it to be detrimental to their own country. So that is quite a high score. If competence creep continues the way that it has over the past decades, then Brexit is not going to be a sole outlier. There is a real risk of this being repeated by other European countries.
Long term, you called for a radical reset, a rebooting, and returning the EU to a cooperative Europe of nations, not a centralized, technocratic fist. What does that look like in plain language for Europe?
It means to renegotiate the treaties, putting many more limits in for supranational competencies, being clearer about what the supranational competencies are. It means to really deal with the doctrine of implied powers, of the supremacy. Direct effects, I think to a large extent, can still remain useful, but the treaties have to be made clearer and shorter. And perhaps the more radical points that I'm making in the report is that we need to get rid of, to reconsider and reboot the acquis communautaire. So that's the collection over years and over decades of all the European norms. It's the laws, so it's the directives, it's the regulations, it's the European Court of Justice decisions. It's all that's the body of norms that make up the legal system of the European Union. This has grown into a completely unusable pile of millions of norms, which no one, including the Commission or its services, can probably understand and overlook. It's not possible anymore. And hence the two examples that I give from past reboots that have taken place, and it actually led to to a considerable growth and reinvigoration of the respective countries. France did this with the Code Napoleon, so with its civil codes in the early 19th century. And Germany did the same thing with the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, so its civil code in 1900. And there was a simplification where they took all civil law and said, we're not going to write a book. What's in this book is going to be from now on the new civil code. Everything that has been in place before is cancelled, except those parts that we put into the new book because they've proven to be useful. And this is something where obviously it's a huge task, but this is something that we need to do with the acquis communautaire. We need to select what we want to keep because it is really useful, and everything else has to be kicked out of the window.
Final question, Philip. If we meet again in 20 years, what would need to have changed for you to say the EU finally stopped its power grab, John, and became stable again? What would have happened?
It would have been, in terms of competencies, really downsized. So it would have changed the course that it is on now into the opposite direction. Very selective in its supranational integration, and much more focused on subsidiarity, as it was perhaps in the beginning of the project. Not just for legal purposes or functional purposes, but also for democratic legitimacy. Subsidiarity, I think, is a really very important item. The closer decisions are being taken to the local or regional or national community that is affected by it, the more, first of all, legitimate the decisions are going to be, the more supported they are going to be by the population, but also the more those decisions are going to take into account the perceptions, the desires, and the arguments of the people that are affected. The more you distance the decision from the level at which they really have the direct effect, the more you introduce room for error, for misappreciation, for errors of judgment, and for bad legislation. And this is something which you can see in several instances at the EU level. It is too anonymous, it is too distant from where the decisions really make their impact. It is too far away from taking into the consideration the input from those people that are directly affected. And if you really come back to subsidiarity and confer it as the core items of European organization, then I think the EU can become a much more healthy organization than it is today. But let's see if we meet again in 20 years, what the verdict is going to be on that.
Philip, thank you for doing the work on this report, because what you've done is you went into something that's incredibly complicated and made it understandable for our viewers and listeners. And we thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you for coming in to talk to us today.
Thank you, John.